Welcome everyone to Capital Quest, Connecting Capital to Communities, introducing the New York Fed Community Development Team's new strategic direction. My name is Carmi Recto, and on behalf of the New York Fed's Community Development Team, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join us at today's event. If you're just joining us, please note that this session is being recorded. All attendees will be in listen-only mode, and there will be no Q&A at this time. For the best view of the panelists, we recommend selecting the grid layout option located in the top right corner of the video segment, then click the View tab on the top left-hand corner of your event screen and uncheck Show Participants Without Video. Before proceeding, please also note that the views expressed in this event are the speaker's own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the New York Fed or the Federal Reserve System. My colleagues and I are excited to welcome you for several reasons. The first is because we're co-releasing a new report, Impact in Place, Emerging Sources of Community Investment Capital and Strategies to Direct It at Scale, written by the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance. This report is a powerful resource for those who seek to deepen their understanding of community investing. It presents an analysis of the current landscape for community investments to provide a perspective on the role that existing sources of capital have played in supporting underserved communities, as well as a detailed discussion of emerging sources of capital that can help shape the future of community investing. Mapping these sources of capital and sparking discussion around how they can work with communities to help recover and thrive is of critical importance to the New York Fed's Community Development Team, as we'd spent the last year thinking about how we can connect transformative ideas supporting low and moderate income communities and communities of color with funding. Today's event is a culmination of that process, and we're excited to introduce our team's new focus areas and our new strategic approach to bridging capital and communities. Without further ado, I'd like to pass the mic over to David Erickson, who heads our community development team to kick off the event. David, over to you.
Thank you, Carmi, and thank you for participating in this event while you're visiting your family in the Philippines. I know it's late there, and I'm really impressed that you're able to pull this off. And thank you all for listening today. Fireworks are coming up after me, so please stay tuned. But I wanted to take this time to share some thoughts with you about the New York Fed, community development, and the importance of investing in low-income communities to the overall economy. When you think of the economy, you may think of terabytes of data crisscrossing the cloud, farmers plowing a field, trucks on a tangle of freeways, and snaking lines of conveyor belts, a humming network whose health is measured in acronyms like GDP or CPI. But the economy as a whole is also a web of kitchen tables, and what happens at those tables determines the wealth of nations. Economists talk about human capital, by which they mean everyone from a toddler spooning applesauce in a house down a gravel driveway to a neurosurgeon finishing her coffee in a brownstone. We measure the health of our human capital in jobs numbers and consumer debt, but we also measure it with data that may seem far removed from the economy of dairy plants and warehouses, data on mortalities, hospitalization, asthma rates, and high school dropouts. Each of these measures of individual and community health has economic implications. The fact is, when some of our human capital, some of our people, are ill, when they're hungry, when they're enmeshed in their own financial worries, our whole economy suffers. We learned this tragically during the pandemic. People of color, poor people, hourly workers, and people in rural communities were hit hardest. The COVID death rate for Black and Latino New Yorkers by April 2020 was twice that for whites. Between February and April 2020, employment declined by more than a third for low-wage workers compared to a decline of 9% for upper middle-wage workers. The suffering was concentrated, but the economic damage was widespread. The nation's gross domestic product shrunk by 32.9% in the second quarter of last year, the sharpest drop on record. People in basement apartments in Queens, small towns in Oneida County, and row houses in Union City suffered more than their wealthier neighbors, but the repercussions of that suffering were felt everywhere. I'd like to talk to you today about why the community development team at the New York Fed cares about these disparities and the work we're doing to address them. So let me give you a little background on what we do. Since the 1980s, each of the 12 reserve banks and our headquarters in Washington have operated a community development function to promote economic growth and financial stability for low-income communities. As head of the New York's Community Development Unit, my team and I serve the people who sit down each night at a constellation of kitchen tables in New York, Northern New Jersey, Fairfield County, Connecticut, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Our district encompasses both the skyscrapers of New York City and the tiny town of Webb, New York. It includes the 130,000 people in Stamford, Connecticut, and the 630 people in Coral Bay, St. John in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The original focus of the Federal Reserve System's community development units was to support the implementation of the Community Reinvestment Act, a federal law passed in reaction to revelations about bank redlining and racial discrimination in home lending. What's become clear in the decades since that law passed is that the segregation that resulted from discriminatory lending hurts Black people, Latino people, and poor people from the day they're born until the day they die. Many of the challenges these communities face started with banks and lending policies. According to an analysis by the real estate company Redfin, the average homeowner in a formerly redlined neighborhood has gained 52% less in personal wealth from property value increases over the past 40 years than one in a green-line neighborhood, a difference of around $212,000 on average. Segregation holds people back in 1,000 ways: segregated schools, food deserts, and lack of health care, to just name a few. The premise of the Community Reinvestment Act is that banks played a role in creating segregated neighborhoods, and they should play a role in addressing the aftermath of that segregation. The community development teams link the banks who must serve communities under the CRA with the people who make change in those communities: neighborhood leaders, nonprofits, businesses, and grassroots groups. We also serve as an independent, nonpartisan source of information, doing research to analyze communities' needs. This information helps policymakers prioritize issues, helps people advocate for programs and services their communities need most, and helps businesses understand what's happening in the communities they serve. This hasn't been high-profile work historically. Still, quietly, the Fed community development teams grew into hubs of ideas around how businesses can invest in the poorest neighborhoods. We've done so with the knowledge that our work is a facet of the Fed's dual mandate, that improving employment in our poorest neighborhoods contributes to a healthier economy for everyone. We produce important research that informs smart policy. For example, our teams Claire Kramer-Mills and Jessica Battisto produced a report in August about the pandemic's effect on Black-owned businesses. The report continues to be cited in the media, and I think it played a role in last summer's corporate commitments to make sizable grants and loans to Black-owned businesses. That's the kind of work we're hoping to do more of. My team and I spent last summer, our attention toggled between hospitals, Zoom, childcare, and street protests, wrestling with how we could use our collective skills, our connections, and our passion to push forward real changes that could help create an economy that works for everyone. We did so knowing that voices of people who live in communities worst hit by poverty, segregation, and COVID must be heard and heeded. We crafted a new strategic plan focused on leveraging our connections in business, finance, and neighborhoods to build bridges between communities and funders. For instance, last year, we convened a group comprised of bankers, business leaders, and tenants' rights activists to address the eviction crisis. Our team synthesized that discussion into a white paper we hope can serve as a roadmap for keeping tenants in their homes. We'll be following up this year, working with the Local Initiatives Support Corporation, the University of Pennsylvania, housing advocates, and business leaders on forums focused on national housing security solutions. As a result of our soul searching over the pandemic summer, my team and I arrived at a new strategy. We concluded that we would focus on fewer things with greater intensity. We picked 3 areas to concentrate on, searching for ideas in those areas that can tear down barriers to economic mobility for low and moderate income people. Our goal is to elevate ideas that have national or even international potential, and we want to connect those ideas to money. Our focus underpinned economic mobility. They are economic drivers of health, household financial well-being, and climate-related risks to low and moderate income populations. I'd like to speak a little bit about why we picked these 3 areas. As the last year has made tragically clear, we can't have a healthy economy without healthy people. And as we've learned, each of us may only be as healthy as our sickest neighbor. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, all men are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. The truth of this has never been clearer. Finding solutions to barriers to good health, especially for Black people, the Latino community, and poor people has never felt more urgent or more necessary to the health of the overall economy. There's a role for professionals in finance, investing, and banking in fixing this. As Maggie Superchurch of the Healthy Neighborhood Equity Fund in Boston says, I can buy stock in a pharmaceutical company that makes a pill to lower blood pressure, but I can't invest in a neighborhood that does the exact same thing. Bringing together businesses, philanthropists, and others to build a pathway to make such investments possible is one of our team's goals. Our second focus is on household economic well-being. Roughly 1/3 of the households nationally told Fed researchers last year that they wouldn't be able to meet an unexpected $400 expense. We saw over the past year that poverty and death are too often dire companions. Overlay a heat map of poverty and a heat map of COVID deaths, and the borders are astonishingly close. A focus on household economic well-being also felt essential to fostering overall economic health. Researchers have found that the financial lives of low-income workers are tremendously complex. One reason, their income is often spiky with periods of pay and periods without. Professionals in finance and business may be able to develop tools that can help low-income workers smooth out their cash flow. Bringing people with that expertise to the table is another of our goals. Finally, climate change. New York and its neighbors have suffered greatly from storms that come with a changing climate, most dramatically during and after Hurricane Sandy. Again, the poorest neighborhoods suffered disproportionately. A loss of power that means the loss of everything in your refrigerator hits New York's Brownsville a lot harder than Soho. Across the country, the poorest and most segregated neighborhoods, the same neighborhoods created by the redlining that gave rise to our work in the first place, can be as much as 12 degrees hotter than their wealthier and whiter neighbors. Finding solutions that help mitigate climate change's effect on poor communities and communities of color also fit well with our core mission. We know these are hard, long-standing challenges. That's why we're framing our work in each of these areas by reaching out for help. We're in the process of assembling a panel of experts and community leaders in each focus area whom we can look to for advice. We're calling these groups our kitchen cabinets. As we look for big ideas in each of these areas, I'm mindful of something that Dr. Jo Ivy Buford of NYU School of Global Public Health said at the first meeting of the health team's kitchen cabinet. She said, wouldn't it be transformational if we could actually do all the things we know we should be doing? One of the things holding us back is funding. So with that in mind, our focus is on connecting ideas that work with funding. And to accomplish that, we've created a new role at the New York Fed. I'm pleased to introduce to you today Otho Kerr, our unit's new Director of Strategic Partnerships and Community Impact Investing. Otho will serve as our first capital connector with a mission of connecting ideas that have the possibility to create real change with funding. Otho has a long track record in doing this work, having been a founding partner at one of the nation's first impact investing funds and served most recently as Chief Investment Officer for Acumen, an international impact investment firm that invests in early stage companies whose products and services enable the poor to transform their lives. As we seek to elevate ideas that have the potential to create real and lasting change, we will also be hosting events like this one today that bring together diverse groups of people to exchange ideas and look for solutions. My hope is that someday soon we can all be together in person to make this exchange richer and more meaningful. My goal is to turn the fortress that is 33 Liberty Street, not too far from Wall Street, into a busy, buzzy center of ideas about expanding economic opportunity, a place that helps build the connections needed to meet the challenges our neighborhoods face in this moment. Our hope is that by identifying and elevating promising ideas that have the potential to make transformative changes and by connecting those ideas with funding, we can begin to dismantle racism and poverty, which serve as barriers holding back our whole economy. Our aim is to ensure that every household, everyone at every kitchen table, and every neighborhood in the 2nd District, from Oneida to Vieques, and the nation as a whole can contribute to a thriving economy for all of us. Thank you so much for listening. And now I'll pass the mic over to Otho Kerr. Otho, take it away.
Thank you, David. If we were in a locker room, that felt like a pep talk. And with that pep talk, we'd be running out onto the playing field with the entire team right now, ready to do the work that you've charged us to do. Thank you, David. And good afternoon, everyone. And especially good afternoon, Fran Seegull. Fran, are you there?
Hi, Otho.
Hey, Fran.
Hi there.
Fran, you and I have been given the charge, the wonderful invitation to spend 20 minutes particularly lifting up and giving focus to a report that you and your team at the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance created in connection with David Erickson's team's new strategic initiative, which he just talked about. And so what I want to do is spend the next few minutes, but as David said, I was brought on to be the capital connector for this new team, and I'm really excited to do that. In this role as capital connector, I am charged with bringing together traditional investors, green investors, community development investors to address some of these big ideas that our team is working on identifying for underserved communities and communities of color. And what we've known or what we believe is that these various capital providers have not necessarily worked as effectively as they could. And so my charge is to work with our teams to help come up with those big ideas and the solutions, hopefully transformative solutions, and move capital into addressing those solutions. But moving capital in a coordinated way with all of those investors in doing so. And as David said, I think he recruited me to take this on because of my experience at Echo Asset Management, which became Encourage Capital, and then Acumen. And working at those two firms, I had experience in climate mitigation, but what we soon learned is that maybe climate mitigation isn't enough, and we have to begin really investing in adaptation and resilience, especially in those communities that are currently underserved. And I also learned a bit more about health equity and the importance to move capital into that space. And in all of that time, I began thinking about capitalism being more inclusive. My great friend, Jacqueline Novogratz, who is the CEO and founder of Acumen, has talked more recently, and I began adopting the language of inclusive capitalism. And I know you'll talk about it a bit more, but I think all of that inspired David to recruit me and join this effort. So I'm excited to be doing that. But enough about me. Fran, tell us about you. Tell us about the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance. And you're a mute, Fran. Great. Perfect.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Perfect. Great. Well, first, thank you to you, David, Carmi, for laying the groundwork for our discussion. We at the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance, we're so delighted to partner with your team on this project that we'll talk about in a little bit. Before I dig in, I just want to thank my colleagues for their great work on the Impact in Place report and the 5 case studies, and I put a link to the report in the chat. So shout out to John Cochran, Senior Manager of Policy and Programs at the Alliance, Miliana, I'm going to try to do the best I can here, Vujosevic, founder and CEO of Next Wheel Consulting, who was instrumental in writing this report, and Claire Mattingly, Program Associate at the Alliance. So that aside, thanks aside, by way of introduction, I serve as president of the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance, which is an organization seeking to catalyze the growth and scale of the impact investing field. We use a few levers to do so, such as advocating for an enabling public policy environment for impact investing, engaging with institutional asset owners to expand the supply of impact capital, and then some broader movement building and narrative building. And just to clarify at the top, I wanted to share how we use the term impact investing, because it may be a little bit different than some folks who are tuning in. So we use the term quite broadly to encompass the practice of investing for positive and measurable social, economic, and environmental impact alongside financial returns across asset classes, strategies, and geographies. So Otho, it could be anything from investing in an ESG ETF or mutual fund, an affordable housing development in Detroit, or a microfinance fund in emerging markets. We consider all of those to be impact investing.
The way when I joined Echo Asset Management, it was literally months right after the term impact investing was coined at a convening of at the Bellagio by the Rockefeller Foundation. And it's a term that's certainly gathered momentum, gathered steam. To some extent, it's gone a little mainstream. But when I talk to young people about impact investing, I describe it as a concept where it requires additionality. It requires, but for the project we're working on or the company we're working and investing in, but for our capital, traditional capital wouldn't have gone in there. So when I think of renewable energy, solar energy projects, I think traditional capital would naturally go in there. So to me, as much as that kind of investment will have an environmental impact, I don't know if I consider that kind of capital to be additional or it to be impact capital. But what you're saying is a little different. Am I correct?
And okay, I'm getting with the program. You can hear me, I presume?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we think a lot about this topic at the Alliance, and there is a bit of a tension between the vision you described for impact, one centered on additionality, and one that might be considered more broad and pragmatic. So while I agree that we should value and encourage investing intentionally for deep impact, and in fact, earlier in my career, that was my focus, investing in private debt, private equity in emerging markets and in domestic ventures. We also believe that we ultimately need to tap into the capital markets in order to leverage enough capital at scale to address the magnitude of the global and domestic challenges that we're facing. So, and I think that this in a way kind of addresses your inclusive capitalism comment earlier, Otho. The impact investing, as we have described it, is really mainstreaming at this time. We see large incumbent actors entering the field, from large private equity firms launching multi-billion-dollar impact funds to the rise of ESG investing among retail to institutional investors. One thing is sure is that as we mainstream and as we bring principles of impact investing to the capital markets, we need better mechanisms for tracking real impact and encouraging impact or demanding impact transparency and accountability so that we can ensure impact integrity as the field scales. So we see some real indications of progress in this respect. For one thing, we're in the midst of a significant regulatory moment, both globally, in Europe, and here in the United States. Regulators are considering how to implement disclosure standards for both companies and investors around things like climate risks, which you brought up, and human capital issues. But beyond this mandatory regulation, which we think is absolutely essential, we're also seeing some promising signs of what we call market-driven change or self-regulation. So for example, Tideline, which is an impact investing consulting firm, recently launched Bluemark, which is one of the first of its kind, an impact verification platform and consultancy, so that asset managers and investors can verify their investment processes and systems. But also in the super mainstream, in the kind of heart of the mainstream, we've seen things like global investment firm Carlyle Group recently announced that their executive compensation will be tied to meeting certain diversity and inclusion metrics. That would be unthinkable, even 18 months ago. Even last week, we saw shareholder engagement as a very important tool for change in the capital markets. So a very small activist investor, Engine One, waged a campaign to install 2 new board members advocating for a shift away from fossil fuels at Exxon. And they got the big State Street, Vanguard, and BlackRock to vote with them. So there's real power, I think, in the markets and some momentum for the economy, an economy that's more accountable. to stakeholders, so not limited to shareholders. And that momentum is building. Well, that momentum predates the pandemic, the health and economic crisis, as David mentioned earlier, and its disproportionate impacts on Black, Brown, and historically marginalized communities have added a sense of urgency. So we think, you mentioned inclusive capitalism. We don't think we get to a reimagined system of capitalism that works for all, just with capital markets transparency, accountability, and disclosure alone. We need to also meaningfully invest in communities and uplift them as essential stakeholders in stakeholder capitalism. So David spoke about how the community development team at the New York Fed developed this new strategic direction in light of the pandemic and ongoing crises. We too at the Alliance spent some time reflecting on our work in that context. And we emerged with a very strong conviction that impact investors have a vital role to play in helping to lift up communities as value stakeholders in this reimagined economic system. So we hope that the Impact in Place report, the 5 case studies that accompany the report, will help us identify some gaps that we need to fill, identify some hurdles that we need to clear to create a more improved future for the community investing field.
Fran, let's pivot to the report, but I just want to react to one of your observations about engine number 1, for example. They actually succeeded in gaining one more seat, a 3rd seat yesterday on Exxon's board. And what was impressive to me about engine number 1, this is a bit of a digression, but as much as we talk about the moral imperative behind many of these initiatives, the moral imperative to save the environment, engine number 1 would say it wasn't the moral imperative that drove their strategy. It was the economic imperative, the business imperative that Exxon had to move to reflect what was happening. So we see a lot of folks who are making a difference in the world. We'd like to think a lot of it's morally driven, but a lot of it is in fact economically driven. Switching to your report quickly, called Impact in Place, Emerging Sources of Community Investment, Capital and Strategies Directed at Scale. It had 2 objectives. One was to set out the landscape of the investors out there who can help us in this space. And also a second objective was to lift up those opportunities to make sure that communities were being heard so that we would listen to voices unheard. Perhaps you can just help us understand generally the landscape as you all see it and what the opportunities are out there.
Sure. Absolutely. So yeah, you touched on, and David touched on, the incredible suffering and loss everywhere during the pandemic and the ensuing economic crisis, but particularly communities of color. And we saw the federal government swing into action. We saw the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP dollars, beginning to flow to small businesses, for example, but they were really leaving entrepreneurs of color behind, as well as rural entrepreneurs and tribal entrepreneurs. We saw a number of different types of groups stepping up and responding very rapidly and creatively, rising to the urgency of the moment that needed a moment. So I think that the Fed saw this report as an opportunity to capture what was happening on the ground in response to the crisis quite quickly, as well as ways that we could consider how we can carry forth this existing momentum. So I'll start with corporates. We saw a lot of sizable commitments from large, well-known corporations to communities, many responding to the pandemic, and as well as the renewed demands for racial justice in light of the killings and brutality of Black Americans, against Black Americans. What we particularly focused on in the report was the fact that these companies, these corporates, were leveraging capital from their corporate treasuries directly, rather than just from their corporate foundations with grant capital alone. So we'll be joined during our upcoming panel by Rosita Najmi of PayPal, a fintech company that made a $535 million commitment to economic development and racial equity, partially through deposits in Black-owned banks and also through investing in Black and Brown-led venture capital firms. We'll also hear from Amir Kirkwood, of Opportunity Finance Network, which partnered with Google to expand small business lending through the CDFI members in the OFN network. And so we hope that corporate treasuries might represent a new avenue for community investing, and that companies will build on this work to reinvest in and partner with the communities that they serve. So that was one observation that we made. Another was the potential to move capital at scale for communities through donor-advised fund, which is a growing form of charitable giving. There's about $140 billion of assets in donor-advised funds in the United States. During the panel, Liz Sessler of CapShift, an impact investing advisory firm, will share some very creative thinking that they've been doing around how to promote the uptake of impact and community strategies among donor-advised fund platforms and their donors. So as a preview, one challenge in encouraging the deployment of capital to community investing through DAFs is that community investing is often hyper-local, while many of the DAF platforms serve a national donor base. So we have some anecdotal indications that donors are increasingly interested in investing in their hometowns and their backyards in response to the pandemic and the economic crisis. The question is how we can harness that demand. And lastly, we looked into participatory models for community wealth building. And these are very exciting strategies that center community members directly in the decision-making process, which shifts the investment paradigm and the traditional power dynamics completely. So one example of that is the Ujima Fund in Boston, which is a democratically managed pool of funds. They prioritize faster and higher rates of return for the local investors who invest in the economic development of their local communities. And these types of participatory models tend to be hyper-local and subscale by design, because growing in size might actually detract from their ability to meet the needs of the communities that they serve, such as, for example, microloans for diverse-owned small businesses. So the goal is impact, deeper impact, and less on scale. But nonetheless, this is a very important and growing practice in the field, and we're excited to see its development. And finally, we observed the rapid catalyzing of large amounts of capital in Chicago, in California, in New York, and here foundations and state governments and other local sources of capital pooled their capital to serve the small businesses and communities in their respective regions. And these were coalesced rapidly among investors and state governments that don't usually move quickly. So that was also thrilling to see.
Fran, we could talk for another 30 minutes. Unfortunately, we don't have another 30 minutes, and I've probably gone over our allocated time, but I'm not going to let it stop here. I would love for you to just share with us, out of this report or out of the work that the Alliance is doing, a call to action that will help inform the work that we do, help inform the work that everybody listening does, and it might also lead into the panel discussion you have coming up.
Yeah, great. So we do have a call to action to the field, and that would be to recognize the new and unique level of engagement in the community investing space in 2020 and 2021 that we talked about a moment ago, and to keep that momentum going. We seem in the United States, at least, to be on the cusp of a new normal. We have this nascent but emerging post-vaccination reality here in the US. What we want to do is really hold front and center all of the systemic faults that the pandemic and the economic crisis laid bare, and build upon that momentum that exists now to address those systemic faults. And just finally, I just want to share that we believe that in order to achieve a just and equitable recovery, and ultimately resilience as well, we must meaningfully invest in communities, and also hold ourselves accountable to them as valued stakeholders and partners.
Fran, thank you. A delight. I'm going to turn the mic over to you so you can lead our next panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Otho. And maybe I can ask the three panelists to come on screen, and I will introduce you. So again, thanks to Otho and David for kicking off the event and setting the stage for the topics we're about to dig into. I am so thrilled to be joined by 3 expert panelists for what I know will be a very engaging conversation about the future of community investing. I'd like to welcome Amir Kirkwood, who is Chief Investment and Network Officer at Opportunity Finance Network, OFN, which is the National Association for Community Development Finance Institutions, or CDFIs. Rosita Najmi, Senior Director and Head of Global Social Innovation at PayPal, a company with a mission to democratize access to financial services. And Liz Sessler, Managing Director of Product and Partnership at CapShift, an impact investing platform for philanthropies and investors, including donor-advised funds. So, as Otho and I spoke about a bit just a few minutes ago, these 3 organizations are featured in the Impact in Place report, and they're also featured in standalone case studies because of their leadership as community investors and because of the innovative strategies and models they're using to drive capital to the most underserved communities, both before and in response to the COVID-19 crisis. So we think that they represent a very good range of perspectives, from the corporate investor perspective to the community lender perspective to the intermediary perspective, CapShift, which helps enable the flow of capital for impact. So it's for this reason that we've brought these folks together. We hope that Impact in Place report and case studies would spark a discussion around these important topics, and we see this panel really as the kickoff to that discussion. So let's dig in. A major motivating factor in writing this report was the fact that we saw so many new sources of capital for driving impact on the ground in communities, whether it was seasoned impact investors banding together to support local CDFI and small business ecosystems, the flurry of major companies making sizable commitments from their corporate treasuries, or simply a renewed energy about how to flow capital to support racial equity and justice. So Amir, I would love to start with you. OFN has, of course, been a leader in the community investing ecosystem for decades. But last year in particular, CDFIs were having a moment, to quote your CEO, Lisa Mensah. So we're wondering if you can kick off the conversation by reflecting on the role of organizations like OFN in the COVID response and recovery phases, especially as it relates to your partnership with major corporations like Google and Twitter.
Sure. Thank you, Fran. And thank you also, David and Otho, for having us here today to speak to all the people who were so willing to join us today on this really important topic and great conversation. As Lisa Mensah, our CEO, says, I couldn't agree more. This is a transformative time for our sector, for CDFIs as a whole, for minority depository institutions, for the intermediary space in general, that's really spent many years in laboring to try and have impacted communities, but have also wanted to bring along new partners to be able to have that impact. So just to start, I want to say thank you to the older partners who have been with us for so long, because they also stepped up in this year. And you could see from the commitments of all the major money center banking institutions, philanthropies, that have helped really in many ways start the field. They also made many major commitments, to your point, Fran, you mentioned earlier, in California, in Chicago, in New York. Many of those efforts were led by long-term institutional partners. But we're really excited also about the new partners who have come along. And OFN in particular has had an opportunity to play what we think is the best role we can play, which is to really sort of facilitate these new partners to our field, not just as investors in capital, but also to be engaged on the policy arguments that are really important to being able to drive capital to our field, and also supporting the operational and technical assistance needs of the intermediaries and partners on the ground who are really driving and doing the work. I'm in a lucky position where I just get to talk to a lot of people with money and convince them to bring money to our field. I don't actually have to get the deal done on the ground. So I take very seriously, and I'm humbled by the opportunity we have at OFN. To talk really specifically about a few of the opportunities we've had, in the last year, 2 particular partners came to us at different stages and said, we want to make a deep impact in how we can invest in commit to change in communities. The first was Google, who came to us towards the end of 2019. And then as the events of 2020 really expanded, and got deeper in both the issues around the pandemic and issues of racial justice, they went beyond just sort of saying, let's make a grant commitment to let's put the Treasury to work. Let's figure out how to do it. And so they came to us and said, is there any way that you guys can figure out how to get 125 million on the ground through CDFIs to support small business? Which of course we said, yeah, we could do that really easily. In the middle of that process, they came to us and said, you know, we really want to make sure that some of this money goes to support Black-owned businesses. So if we could come up with another 50 million, would you all be able to help get that on the ground? And we said, sure, we'd be able to do it. And we only did that. We only were able to make that commitment because of the amazing work that CDFIs are doing. That total commitment that Google made of $180 million, when we put out an application to the membership, came back oversubscribed 5 times. And that was just CDFIs who were willing to focus a majority of their work on small business lending and also nonprofit lending. And that was a testament to the need, first and foremost, in the communities at that time. But it was also a testament to the, just the willingness of a corporate partner to engage with our field. And what really made it a powerful moment, and what I think is speaking to the importance of working with corporate treasuries, is that in the design of the funding, they agreed to 3 really important principles for us. Number 1, the funding was long-term. Number 2, it was cheap. And number 3, it wasn't so covenant-laden that the CDFIs could not do the work that they needed to do on the ground with the small businesses. So that was a very successful effort in bringing a partner to our sector. And then later in the year, we were able to have a new partner in the form of Twitter join us for something we've called the Finance Justice Fund effort, where we're seeking to raise $1 billion in corporate partnerships to come to our field as well. That effort has been successful. It's continuing to grow. We're continuing to engage new corporate partners. But critical to that is Twitter's agreement also to the very same principle that the CDFIs are the best arbiters of how to get that capital to the businesses and developers and community organizations on the ground. So in those 2 ways, it was very the right and successful type of relationship. There's a third relationship that I think is really important to mention that affected our field very dramatically in this last year. And it was by a woman named Mackenzie Scott, who put $400 million of wealth behind the CDFI sector in less than 12 months in time. And for anyone who knows how a CDFI operates, it is those unconditioned grant dollars that are really the essential piece to unlock their ability to get more leverage from lenders, for them to do what I think is important, which is be able to recycle that capital multiple times over the life of that debt, so that they're really able to have multiple impacts during that period of time. And then the final thing that all these new partnerships really have brought to us is an important shift that is really subtle, but is really speaking to where I think the impact investment world is moving. The historical world of our longtime partners in the banking sector had obviously for obvious reasons, had to focus a lot on compliance, a lot focused on the CRA, Community Reinvestment Act. In the case of these new partners, they're not operating from a regulated perspective. And so they've gone straight to the impact. And they want to know not just where you lent, can you report to me the impact of this on the ground to businesses? Can you show me stories of that impact? And then it also led them to sort of add to that a desire to want to add value in the form of technical assistance, advice. In the case of our Google relationship, they actually were able to give us some support for CDFIs on SEO optimization, search optimization, which is really powerful if you're, for example, a small business lender operating in an area where there's a lot of payday lenders. The opportunity for you to be able to elevate your where you sit in the search on Google is a really powerful way to combat against predatory lending. So it's all of these factors together that I think are collectively why these new partnerships have been really important for us.
Amir, thank you. Thank you for sharing. And I think that this is a great transition to ask Rosita a question. PayPal committed, as I mentioned before, $535 million to promote economic development and racial equity, and was also the largest corporate investor in List's Black Economic Development Fund. Wondering if you can share what motivated these commitments from PayPal and the vision for how the funds are being deployed or will be deployed.
Absolutely. Thank you, Fran, for the opportunity to be a part of this really important conversation, and just so grateful to the Alliance and to the New York Fed for your leadership in elevating this frontier conversation and opportunity of impact. PayPal was actually very lucky to have already been pretty well primed when the health, economic, and social justice crises of 2020 hit America and the rest of the world. And in less than a year, we've actually already deployed 510 of the 535 million, and 485 million of that was in impact investing. To directly answer your question, I would identify 3 drivers as contributing to the motivation behind the commitment as well as the swift execution of it. The first is just our alignment across mission, vision, and values of advancing financial health, and our commitment and belief in the concept of stakeholder capitalism. The second is 5+ years of learning and thinking and experimenting of what our role is in helping small businesses succeed. And the third is just the knowledge of America's racial wealth gap and how much larger this gap was growing because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And as a company, the company that's committed to democratizing financial services and improving financial health, we were determined to do our part. And so the first thing we did was we started to listen. We turned to our Black leaders inside and outside the company. And we were really focused on how and where PayPal could make the biggest contribution. And what we identified pretty quickly was an immediate need for an emergency response to the crisis that Black businesses were facing, as well as a long-term need for ongoing, continued support for these Black businesses, both in creation as well as to overall helping them contribute to the closing of the racial wealth gap. And we were committed to doing this in a holistic way. And so in order to do that and to move at the speed that we were hoping to move, we decided to partner with organizations that already had existing connections and already had experience and understanding to not just get the funds to the right people, but to get it to them quickly. So June 11th, just about a year ago, we launched this multi-pronged set of initiatives, and I'll quickly run through how it breaks down. So the first chunk of about 35 million broke down into 3 buckets. The first was 15 million, which is direct emergency cash grants, empowerment grants to help Black-owned businesses cover expenses and just help stabilize and make it through the pandemic. The second bucket was $5 million of grants that went to 20 leading nonprofit community partners across the US, both national serving and local, that were serving Black-owned businesses with on-the-ground support and capacity building. And then the third bucket was $15 million, which was to acknowledge our own opportunity of growth and improvement in terms of strengthening PayPal's internal diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging programming, and to fund research and evaluation that can inform public policy related to racial equity issues. So then comes the big chunk, the 500 million. And this was the impact investing category. And we formed an economic opportunity fund for minority-led high-growth startups, venture investing, as well as depository holdings in minority-owned banks and credit unions. And as I mentioned, 485 of this 500 million has been dispersed. You already acknowledged the $50 million that we were honored to collaborate with LISC to contribute to their Black Economic Empowerment Fund. Through our ventures team, we had $100 million that we invested across 2 rounds to a total of 19 Black and Latinx-led VC funds. And just yesterday, we announced $135 million of deposit into mission-driven financial institutions and management funds that help underserved communities of color to fight these barriers of economic inequality. And those include Hope Credit Union, One United Bank, Self-Help Federal Credit Union, C-Note's Wisdom Fund, and we're able to reach various smaller institutions through C-Note Promise Account. What's inspired me most about all of this is that PayPal was able to pull this off without hiring additional staff, and it was put on top of very full plates. And what drove the velocity and the creative problem solving and, quite frankly, financial structuring that was needed was the knowledge for our employees that our efforts would be keeping businesses open. It would be giving Black entrepreneurs a leg up in an uneven playing field. We were enabling communities to find resilience and strength to push through a tumultuous year, and we were doing our part to create a path to an equitable, inclusive recovery.
Thanks for sharing that, Rosita. It's so inspiring to hear about this breakdown and the speed with which this capital has been deployed and using skill sets and assets in place to do some different things. So thank you so much for sharing about that. Liz, I'd love to move to you now and CapShift, which does a lot of very interesting work to foster the uptake of impact investing strategies with DAFs. And I would just say that sometimes on first glance, DAFs and their $140 billion seems like a very exciting pool of capital to tap into for impact. And in fact, CapShift, Impact Assets, and others in the space have done a lot of work developing and marketing impact investing products for donor advisors. But there are at times some structural barriers that prevent broader uptake. So wondering if you can share a little bit about what you think could be a game changer for flowing DAF assets to communities at scale.
Great, thanks, Fran, and really excited to share with everybody today. And I think, just like you said, when people hear about donor-advised funds, which are pools of philanthropic assets, and they are valued at about 140 billion, maybe a little bit greater, we're kind of waiting for 2020 numbers. It seems like, oh, this is game-changing capital, but I think different than, what Amir was talking about with working with corporates or what Rosita was talking about with decision makers at PayPal, donor-advised funds are made up of lots and lots of individuals. And so while there is a corporate entity or a nonprofit entity that is making the decisions ultimately about where funds are granted out and where they're invested, they work very closely with the individual donors who gave that capital to the donor-advised fund initially to have them make recommendations. And so in order to unlock that capital, we have kind of a mass education effort that we as CapShift or impact assets or community development leaders have to undertake. And I think one of the best things that we can see happen is some of these corporate leaders and large philanthropists publicly talking about how they're using their own corporate dollars, modeling some of those investment opportunities, because we do see individuals who have DAFs using those donor-advised funds in similar ways, right? They like to think about them as independent kind of foundations and things like that. What I want to emphasize to everyone is just because the donor wants to do it doesn't mean it can necessarily overcome all the institutional structures, and we'll talk about some of that. But the thing that's going to move the needle fastest for any donor-advised fund is individual donor demand. And so that's kind of a key component to moving this forward. What CapShift has found in working with both large national donor advised fund providers like a Fidelity Charitable or a Vanguard Charitable, as well as with local community foundations, is that at a base level, a lot of the donors who contributed their money to this donor advised fund know that they have the ability to make recommendations on grants and don't understand that they have the ability to make a recommendation around the investment capital and how it's used. So just to go into a little bit of nitty gritty detail here, most people make that investment allocation the day they make the contribution on an application, and they don't think about it again. And we do find that there's kind of a priority of assets, right, where people think long and hard about things in a brokerage account or their cash accounts, and then their philanthropic dollars can fall kind of on a back burner. And so part of what we do at CapShift is kind of raise that forward and show them easy paths to investing in organizations like community development financial institutions. Another thing that we've seen is most people approach their donor advised fund from a mentality of gift giving. And that's led us to move towards something called recoverable grants. And for those of you who've been in and around the philanthropic space for a long time, this isn't a new tool. But for a lot of donors, they've never heard of the ability to give a grant and then have it recovered under certain conditions. We found this is particularly helpful as subordinated capital in new business lines. It was very helpful during the COVID-19 crisis when a lot of organizations that were doing lending needed emergency capital that may or may not be recovered, right? In a best case scenario, if the world looked the way, we all hoped it would look, that money was going to be easy to return over, let's say, a year to a 3-year time period. If the crisis continued and financial markets didn't come back, if we didn't find different ways to do business, people needed grant capital just to stay alive. And it was a perfect tool to use in a very uncertain environment where, a total loss becomes a grant. A recovery means the donor has the ability to kind of recycle that money and use it for their original grant making purposes. And what we saw throughout last year was kind of a set of crises that really motivated individual donors to take action. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. The next kind of barrier that I think is really important to highlight is just the kind of infrastructure barriers of working with more traditional financial institutions and using things like community development financial institutions and other impact investments. So we have an education gap with financial professionals who advise people both on their brokerage accounts, but also on their philanthropic investments. And as a kind of industry, we really need to get out there and help them understand where do CDFI investments play in their portfolio. That may mean more definition of the different asset classes. It also means helping them understand the value of telling the impact story. When I talk to financial advisors who've integrated this into their clients' philanthropic portfolios or their investment portfolios, it's always one of their favorite ways to engage in quarterly meetings is to share an impact report. They find that it is very good in retaining clients, but that story isn't being told often enough. And when somebody's paying you to be the expert, the last thing any of us want to do is go into a client meeting with something that we're less confident on. So CapShift works really closely as a sub-advisor with a number of financial advisors that want to integrate that. And we tend to start with philanthropic assets because it's a great place for people to begin learning about impact investments. And as we mentioned, it's kind of a large pool of capital. I think the report that was published today does a great job of kind of going through some of the other individual barriers there. So I won't go too deep into any of those, but I think really going into the kind of, I'm going to say, sophistication of the CDFI market and helping people understand how investing in the CDFI can be both a safe investment under the right circumstances and a part of a portfolio strategy to have both impact and financial return is really important. And it goes a long way to kind of clear that fiduciary barrier that a lot of people have kind of had stand in the way of making impact investments out of, corpus accounts and something other than a program related investment account. So with that, maybe Fran, I'll hand it back to you.
Great, thank you, Liz. I realize some of this is pretty technical. I think you did a great job of staying at the right altitude, though the report does go into some more detail for folks that are interested. One of the conclusions that we refer to throughout the report is that while some of these new sources of community investment capital are very exciting, whether they're new entrants or cutting edge strategies or more traditional investors in community investing moving more quickly in a more innovative way, we don't really have a sense of how durable some of them will be beyond the current moment. So Rosita, how is PayPal thinking about the future of corporate community engagement in the space? And wondering if you're seeing, and you talked about stakeholder capitalism a moment ago, do you think that we're seeing a rewriting of the social contract between companies and their stakeholders, including consumers, workers, and the communities? And how can we continue to build on the practices of leveraging corporate treasuries to not only extend the commitments, but also to continue the innovation and the engagements?
Absolutely. A few reflections, and I have six specific recommendations of what can unlock these, I think, up to probably $2 trillion that's on the table. So yes, I absolutely have been delighted to see this shift and rewriting of a number of contracts. So the first contract is actually the relationship between citizen and state. We've seen it change, and we've noticed how trust is also changing, and we've been observing these shifts in expectations of who does these actions. And it's not just limited to government anymore in terms of providing these social safety nets. And we're noticing this shift between citizens and companies as well. We're also noticing this increase in both consumer as well as employee activism. Employees at PayPal are number one, and they are the most critical asset that we have in terms of really driving this culture that's committed to impact as part of everything we do. And all of this and the complexity of the current challenges, whether it's a global pandemic, racial or gender inequity issues, it's really going to require companies to think beyond just financial capital and to think about all their stakeholders. And in the case of PayPal, that's employees, our customers, our regulators, our shareholders, and planet. These audiences are looking to companies like us that have prioritized purpose. And they're expecting us for our leaders, like our CEO, to use his voice as well as other senior executives and our influence to be a part of the conversation and thinking about these solutions. And there's also an opportunity, I think, of looking at other types of capital. So obviously there's a critical need for financial capital, but there's also a role for human capital, network capital, intellectual, and also reputation capital. And I think that's where we can create some opportunities of innovation, is if we unlock ourselves from the limitations of financial capital. Thinking about, in our case, how can we lend our platform and the rails to flows of money to and from? What's the role of our employees' talent and time? And what's our capacity? What part of our innovation can we lend out? Check writing is certainly important, and we heard from Liz, it's critical. But we also know how important it is to have long-term sustainable and scalable opportunities. And I think that's going to happen when you unleash the engine of capitalism to pull this wagon of justice. So I'll give 3 examples of what PayPal kind of learned and observed, and then the 6 recommendations. So first, we really pushed ourselves through COVID and the social justice crises of 2020 to think about how do we leverage both our technology as well as our treasury. And on the technology side, it was clear at the beginning of the pandemic, the government needed help getting money out. And so we figured it out. We were not in the business of G2P payments, but we were among the first non-bank lenders to be able to contribute to the distribution of the PPP funds to small businesses. And we're able to contribute to 2 billion of those loans, getting to over 76,000 small businesses, which we estimated to save over 308,000 jobs. Again, we were not experts in public health, but we knew and realized that our technology could help be a part of the solution. And we were working on a project with the creation of a QR codes. And we fast-tracked that up. And we rolled out QR codes to provide touch-free payment technology in 28 markets around the world. And third, we saw very clearly in our transactions of both our consumers as well as our merchants the volatility of the income streams. And so we rolled out a product called Pay in 4. And what it does is it allows you to buy something and you can pay it back in 4 interest-free installments. And it provides a solution both for the consumer who needs that product now but doesn't have the income, but it also gives that income to that merchant so that they can remain productive. So in terms of the 6 recommendations for unlocking corporate treasuries, to the regulators, you have a critical role in terms of how much of our cash balances is available. This is going to be dependent on the industry. In the case of a financial service provider, there's some rules around liquidity, but I think there could be some room on innovation in terms of how much of that, how much of our cash can actually be available versus kind of retained because of liquidity and other types of regulatory requirements. To those providers in the ecosystem that do technical assistance, corporate treasuries need help updating their policies and strategies to mainstream impact investing principles to all steps of the process: equitable sourcing, due diligence, decision-making, reporting. They're just going to need help. They don't have these experts in-house. And so for those of you who are in a capacity to provide them, raise your hand, create products that are cheap and off the, make it easy for people to say, okay, I'm going to hire you to do this. The third would be human capital. Corporate treasuries are going to have to staff up. They should not fake it till they make it. Impact investing is a craft, and they need to hire people that have both the skills of investing as well as the impact evaluation side. The fourth would be a message to the market, and that our observation was that we had to really lean in and help with the structuring, and that the current pipeline in the market is not really set up well to meet the terms of treasury policies. Whether it's on, the patients that Amir talked about in terms of the term, the number of how much time you've got, as well as other considerations like it's just not currently, there's not a lot of options. So it requires the corporate treasuries to be really creative, and they just might not have the bandwidth or the risk tolerances from the legal teams to do that. A message to the community and the ecosystem is, I think treasurers and their teams would benefit from just kind of a peer-to-peer group. So when I think of groups like the GIN, Mission Investors Exchange, like maybe thinking about how to create communities of practice for these treasurers to feel like they're not doing it alone, and that they have a community of people. And there's already a list, right? I have a list of, we have it. So let's get them together. Let's create opportunities for them to engage efficiently. And the final would be to the media and, quite frankly, the broader ecosystem. Start talking about it, create a buzz, help raise awareness and understanding so that more people can participate.
Great. This blog post is writing itself. Got to get going on it, Rosita. These are great recommendations for different constituencies in the market. So, Liz, would love you to speak a little bit about CapShift's partnership with the Case Made, both in terms of what motivated the partnership as well as the methodology in creating the racial justice framework and sourcing report, and how you're using that as an investment tool for donor-advised funds, donors, and others.
Sure. So like I mentioned, last year we saw kind of a convergence of crises with COVID-19 and a call for racial justice across the country. And because of that, we were hearing from a number of donors at the various donor advised fund providers that we work with, all asking for how could they use their philanthropic assets to pursue really racial justice is what we were being asked for. At the same time, we were seeing inbound from a number of different investment opportunities. And just to give everybody a sense of scale, we have a database of about 1,500 impact investment opportunities. Those range from ESG style mutual funds to private direct small business investments. And they all come through our system, and we do a set of filtering on them. And historically, we had allowed people to self-identify, and then we had validated as part of a due diligence process whether or not we thought something was appropriately tagged for different impact categories. And so racial justice was one we were allowing people to, self-identify. And our research team kind of held up their hand as they were looking through what we could potentially put out to donors and said, a lot of this doesn't feel like it's very credible, right? I mean, these are organizations and funds that we've been talking to in the past, and sure, maybe they disproportionately serve a BIPOC community, but there's nothing intentional about what they're doing. And we just didn't feel like we could, in good faith, take those opportunities to donors who were actively trying to be intentional in how they were using their philanthropic dollars and say, these are the right investments for you. So we did a first pass initially in-house with, what would it look like if someone wanted to build a portfolio that was oriented towards racial justice? And when we looked at it internally, it felt, I'm going to say, a little bit negative, right? It felt like a laundry list of problems that we could address, but not like a vision for the future. And so we reached out to Dr. Tiffany Manuel at the Case Made, and her organization helps organizations like ours intentionally tackle the issues of systems change, equity, and inclusion, and think about a vision of what the world might look like if it were racially just. And so she and her team took that kind of first draft that we had that was a laundry list of problems and said, no, we're looking to build a world where these problems don't exist, but there's a way that we get there. And investing for racial justice is actually a spectrum that starts at diversity, equity, and inclusion, moves through racial equity, and then to racial justice. And there's a very small percentage of impact investments that was in CapShift's database that were actually pursuing that kind of top of the pyramid racial justice. And so it gave us language to talk to donors about, risk, return, and impact, and how they wanted to create that. And what we found was that you could construct a portfolio that looked at racial justice overall, where most likely the liquid portion of the donor advised fund was going to be in diversity, equity, and inclusion products, right? So you have high liquidity, you have low risk, they tend to be larger products, and what they can do is prioritize, services to underserved communities. They can focus on board representation, management representation, but they're not going to end up doing some of that harder work. We saw a lot of community development financial institutions fall in the racial equity bucket. So they were pursuing, improved housing quality, access to healthcare, better jobs, and a lot of instances, minority businesses, and getting them funding because of COVID. And then there was this kind of top of the pyramid that I mentioned, racial justice investment opportunities that were being very intentional about how they were bringing community voices into the funding step. They tended to be hyper local, where they could know the people that they were serving on a regular basis, and they were using really interesting and kind of alternative structures. One that I like to hold up as just a great example of racial justice is Boston Impact Initiative. And for those of you who are familiar with them, I always say they kind of take the traditional capital stack and they turn it on its head, and they say, you know, minority small business owners are already taking incredible risk just by starting a business, right? It is a trade-off of what they could be doing with their time, where they could be earning wealth and from a stable salaried job. They're taking a risk. They're normally serving their community by creating this business. And so they should not be the organization that loses the most in the event that the business is maybe moderately successful. And so we put them at the top of the capital stack with the least risk, because they're taking a lot of risk in their personal life. If you are bringing traditional market rate capital to the table, you sit underneath them. You don't have a mission component, but you're supporting small businesses. Likely, if you ended up here, you do. And then for those people who are bringing philanthropic capital, so that tends to be our donor advised fund holders and other foundations, we ask that you take the most risk, right? You have already received a tax benefit for the contribution of those assets, and ultimately they are earmarked to be donations. And so please take the lowest risk and the least amount of return in this, in order to kind of correct systemic injustices around wealth, where wealth is concentrated. And so that's an example of a racial justice investment. And I think we are seeing more of those. We think it's really important to have money flowing so that these opportunities have track records and can fall into some of the more traditional buckets of investments, where we see more and more investors crowding into them. But at this point, our sourcing report is a living document. It's available on our website, and it has, you know, investment opportunities that are coming into Cap Shift that fall across all three buckets. And we work with investors to kind of meet their risk, return, and impact objectives across all three buckets. I think, does that hit on most of your questions, Fran?
Yeah, it does. And it would be great if you could put a link to the sourcing report in the chat
I can definitely do that.
For folks who are interested. Thank you so much, Liz. So Amir, circling back to you at long last. So I just want to say for the panelists, we're going to have this conversation for another 10 minutes. So we have a little bit more breathing room. Amir, you did touch on public policy in your opening remarks, and we were very excited to see the $12 billion in support for the CDFI and MDI sector and the omnibus bill at the end of last year, with $3 billion going to Treasury Department CDFI fund and $9 billion going to expand small business lending by CDFI depositories. So while we praise this $12 billion, it's also long overdue. How do you think about keeping the spotlight on the community investing industry as an essential vehicle by which to serve the hardest to reach communities with policymakers and others?
Yeah, it's a great point, Fran, and we're vastly excited, as you said, about what was huge injection of capital for the sector. The first and most important way to keep the spotlight on, I think, is how that capital and how it's, you know, the efficiency in which it's getting to the CDFIs and MDIs on the ground, the effectiveness that they have in deploying that capital, and also figuring out ways to leverage that capital. For us in the CDFI sector, the $3 billion that's roughly, it's sort of the recovery, the rapid relief portion of it goes directly to equity, and a CDFI that then goes to PayPal or goes to Google or goes to any of these companies now has a much more stable platform in which they can go and be underwritten. Getting to some of Rosita's wonderful 6 points that I wish I had heard before we started on this path. It's an important thing to have that type of capital. I think another critical thing we have to do in our sector is really, and another one of Rosita's points about telling the story, the power of PPP lending. 70% of the loans made by CDFIs and MDIs went to borrowers at $150,000 or less. So these are real on the ground businesses. This is not the fraudulent things you heard about on the Wall Street Journal or the Bloomberg News feeds. This is what really actually happened with small businesses on the ground. And it was CDFIs and MDIs that led the way on that type of lending. So I think that's another piece. I think another really important thing to recognize is that having a component of the funding that really starts at the state level is critical, not just things always sitting at a relationship at the federal level. There was a state small business credit initiative that was recapitalized as part of that initiative that had $10 billion of support. It's going through rules right now. But again, this is more of how you recreate the New York Forwards in New York City or the other programs in California and other areas that are more localized, then it's spreading it to rural America and spreading it to indigenous America as well, that you can actually have support programs for small businesses. So it really is, again, talking about the work that we've done historically. I think going forward, there's also a need for us to continue to push to implement more increased annual appropriation for CDFI fund. The high watermark might have been $350 million, I think, in 1 year under the Obama administration. We've seen great improvement. We saw, we're starting to see great movement forward this year in the discussions, and so we'll probably get up to that level. But OFN and many of the other trades are advocating that it should be $1 billion a year annual appropriation because the field is now 1,100 CDFIs. And why is that critical? When you look at the composition of what has happened in the sector, at least from OFN's perspective of our membership, the majority of our membership now are CDFIs with 25 million in assets or below. And most of the growth that we've seen in the last few years are CDFIs with 10 million in assets and below. So this is not the LISC and the enterprise who are able to operate at a national level, have the capacity to look in and try to touch different parts of the the whole capital continuum, including bond markets. These are the ones that were the LISC of 1989, 1990, were just starting out and are doing the really deep on the ground work with new participants in the business sector or new people in need of housing. So this is an important part of the CDFI sector that needs to be funded, and why that appropriation is important. And I guess the last thing I would sort of say, Fran, is something that you and I had a chance to dance around for the last year, which is really the issue of liquidity and trying to figure out how do we partner with the federal government, either on the side of the budgetary side coming from Congress or on the monetary side from the Federal Reserve, to identify ways to support ongoing liquidity for the field. It's exciting that PayPal and other corporate partners are on board, but I think Rosita's points were really well taken, that there has to be some sort of partnership with the regulators to enable them to change their IPSs to allow for this to become a part of how they can approach strategy. For us practically, it is really great now that there is a market for cash that effectively makes a 3% loan to a CDFI pretty good loan for pretty good use of their capital. But there's going to come a point where all of a sudden it's going to be some compression, right? And so at that point, the terms we are trying to get today may not be the same 3 years from now, 4 years from now, 5 years from now. So this need for liquidity and support around liquidity is important, because I prefer to be able to go to Rosita and say, here's an off-ramp for your LISC loan that would allow you to be able to reinvest in the sector. But as long as we stay a hold to maturity market and not an available for sale market, it becomes kind of challenging to continue to go to the corporate partners with the same conditions as today. So liquidity and some sort of partnership with the federal government around liquidity would be great.
Yeah, I feel like we're tippy-toeing toward the third rail of interest rates in a New York Fed conversation, but you're absolutely right. Things change as interest rates change. So thanks, Amir. I realize we have really only a couple of minutes left before we turn it back to Otho. So I'm going to give you folks a choice about your kind of final word. Liz, one of the things you talked about around racial justice investing, the most progressive and direct in the spectrum that you shared. Really talked about power sharing, decision making sharing with communities. And so one question that you could opt to answer is, how do we ensure that communities are authentically engaged in decision making across our economy? How do we validate communities as valuable stakeholders in stakeholder capitalism? Or you could do a call to action. It does seem like maybe, Rosita, you checked the box of the call to action with your six items, and maybe Amir, you did too. So just give you the choice about how you want to, use your last minute, 30 seconds, actually.
Maybe what I'll say is kind of a throwback to where we started with the donor advised funds, is that people should be intentional about how they're using their capital. And I also want to say there's no wrong place to start. And so if you're not in a position where you can start at that kind of far end of the spectrum, doing anything and knowing what you own is probably the best place to get started. And there are lots of resources out there to support people in making those decisions. And I think all of us on this call are there and happy to point you in the right direction.
Rosita?
Sure. So I'll use my time to share a quote from the book Decolonizing Wealth, which says, effectively using money as medicine requires the funder to have deep, authentic knowledge of the issues and communities that we will be putting the funding to use. Deep, authentic knowledge does not come from reading some stats, reports, or articles. It doesn't even come from a site visit to that community or interviewing someone from that affected community. It comes from living inside that community and experiencing that issue for oneself, period. When I was 15, I got a postcard in the mail in my rural East Tennessee home. And I had a single mom, and this postcard was apply for a $10,000 loan from a local CDFI, which is Fahey, for those of you who may know it. And I thought it was too good to be true. I thought it was like some, clearinghouse type, publisher's clearinghouse, like phony, but I was like, all right, I'm going to apply. We got that $10,000 loan. We changed our windows, we changed floors, we made our home more energy efficient. We made a huge difference for my mom's hourly income. I will never forget what it felt like to get that $10,000 loan. And I think that that's the type of changes we need to do in terms of making sure we're putting people in the decision-making roles that have that lived experience, that will take the time to invest in the capacity building and creating opportunities for consultative, equitable sourcing, and equitable decision-making.
Thank you, Rosita. Thank you for sharing that story. Amir?
What she said.
Words of wisdom? What Rosita said?
What she said.
Okay.
As an advocate for the field, I couldn't say it better.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, all of you, for your insights and your work, your dedication to the work. We really look forward to continuing these conversations. We want to thank the New York Fed team for inviting this incredible group of panelists to speak. Encourage all of you to check out the Impact in Place report and the 5 case studies. I put the link in the chat. It can be found at the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance website or the New York Fed's Community Development and Outreach website. And with that, I will turn it back to Otho for some closing reflections.
Thank you, Fran, for leading a wonderful discussion. Thank you, Amir, Liz, and Rosita. Your final quote, Rosita, will certainly have us thinking about the work that we do as far as using money as medicine. There's a lot for us to chew on there. Thank you. We've come to the end of our session, but I'd love to leave you with some final thoughts. At the New York Fed, we believe we have the responsibility to protect and fortify the economy. And we believe we can do that in part by lifting up underserved communities, especially communities of color. And we're doing that, as you know, just watch us at the in the community development group, by pursuing our new strategic plan. As David said, we are looking to identify problems within climate adaptation and resilience, health equity, household financial well-being, and we're looking for solutions to the problems that we lift up. We hope to find some transformative solutions that we can connect capital to, or connect capital to those solutions. We're going to use traditional capital, impact investment capital, green capital, community development capital, and we're going to bring them all together to work effectively. You can see us looking to work with large financial intermediaries who can scale and access the capital markets. And you're also going to see us working with subscale, high-touch models that can reach deep into communities, the capillaries, if you will. But all of this will require a certain amount of moral imagination. We hope that we can help define success as not only being financial return, but significant impact as well. So stay tuned, watch us. Thank you for coming, and have a great day.